Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Weaving Stories of Possibilities. My name is Tyson, and today I'm so glad to be able to talk with my friend and fellow artist, Jaqs. Recently they wrote a book, or edited a book called Home is in the Body, which is a focus on FillipiniX Femme, two-spirited LGBTQIA plus people. And it's a stories about people's experiences. And as Jaqs is a anti-racism facilitator, we really talk about the work of systemic change and what that might mean for community, and empathy and healing as a real focus to our conversation, and how community can help each other heal. So I'm so honored to have her come and talk with us today, and I'm really looking forward to other people listening in. So thanks so much, Jaqs, and to everyone else, enjoy listening. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be talking to Jaqs today, a little bit about what their experience is around community and what was made possible for them, and the various stories about how that was weaved together. So thanks, Jaqs, for participating today and being in conversation with myself and others. I've been kind of starting off with asking the question of, where do you know from? So I'm curious, what does that mean for you? And what does your experience look like?
First, thanks for having me, Tyson. And I right away, I could say that I know from being an arrivant, a second-gen Filipinx arrivant and settler here on stolen Blackfoot, Sutina, and Stony Yarhe territory and land. Much of my experience as growing up as second gen, my parents did the best they could to provide me with tools to succeed in this context and to assimilate as effectively as possible. So I am a coconut in my father's eyes, and brown on the outside, and I don't speak Tagalog, which is a slow process for me in learning. And AROC also informs much of what I do. Where I met you, the Anti-Racist Organizational Change Project through CommunityWise. It informs all of the organizing that I do, and also even my personal relationships. And also I learn and know from voices. Much of the work I do is informed from voices, the Two-Spirit LGBTQIA plus coalition of people of color. Those two together helped me understand that it's okay for us and good for us to have spaces by and for our communities, whether it's QT BIPOC, whether it's Filipinx, whether it's any intersection that I live. I feel that it's important that we are the ones who organize it, the spaces that we create and hold.
Thanks so much for sharing that. Something that specifically, I think, what you've said about what you know from, and maybe like the culmination of that, is this beautiful book here, Home is in the Body. And, you know, something that you created over this last, well, I mean, it's been more than just the past 2 years, but I'm curious about how that has informed what I'm holding right now.
Oh, everything that I've experienced, or okay.
Well, I mean, everything you've experienced, but what is it? What is it? How has that really informed the Home is in the Body?
I am late to the game of, not the game, the journey of activation as someone who has decolonizing and anti-racism as part of how I daily move and navigate spaces. So I had never really seen a book before that was, that represents the Filipinx second gen experience, specifically in the north of the 49th parallel context. There's a great deal of work that's been published and created for Filipino Americans, for Pinays, for Pinxies, whatever. There are many different terms for people in the diaspora, but for Filipinx in Canada, there are only a couple books by some academics, and I felt that I wanted to make something that was a part, that something that represents like the world that I navigate in, which is like photography and art and music and activism. And many people who are part of this project, Homes in the Body, are in those spaces. So I was really thankful to have gone to the Pinay Power 2 conference in Montreal, hosted by Monica Batak at McGill and the amazing young FillipiniX people who helped and organize that 2019 in Montreal. And that's where I took many of the photos at that conference and many of the interviews that are coming out in a documentary that I am editing. Yes, I know you're smiling, really funny, but it's happening. And I found that was a really beautiful space to be in. I never, it's also shaped how Bahaghari, the queer trans Filipinx and Bakla group in grassroots group here in Calgary has shaped to becoming something that where people can just show up in community. And we haven't organized anything recently, but we had funding from Calgary Foundation, which we did a lot with. So going back to Homes in the Body, the title of it is to also to address the dissociative nature of capitalism, because I think in order to live in an urban sprawl, well, I've adopted some sort of dissociative subtype to be able to not see people, not see the humanity in everybody, and to be conscious of that. All of the things that I seek out have informed how I can unlearn that separation from feeling and from being outside of experience. So like, for example, I just saw this film by Elmaya Tailfeather's Gimme Bitsin, The Meaning of Empathy, which you said is playing at the Social Justice film?
Yeah, the Calgary, Social Justice Film Fest, tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know when this isn't going to come on, but it's on the 21st. But wherever you can find it, please find that film. There's a lot that is not spoken about in like dominant culture to learn and understand fully the impact of a continued genocide of people through intergenerational trauma, and how we stigmatize drug addiction in a way that doesn't look at how those addictions are formed in the first place. So empathy is something that I also explore as well.
And I think that's something, can I just really brief? So I'm going to just read from the intro here. Through disparity of your, so just this is a collection of people's the FillipiniX Femme folks who are captured in here about their stories and their experiences. And just at the beginning, you talk about that community. And so through disparity of values and experiences between generation, class, ability, mental health, spoken language, or region can create challenges in building community and solidarity of advocacy within a two-spirit LGBTQIA plus spaces. Organizing an anti-oppressive social justice work is strong among Filipinx. And this is kind of what I feel like you're leading to, which is, and it is here where we can find healing together.
Absolutely.
And I guess I'm really, the healing to really about all of the things that you just mentioned, and also the understanding that we need it because of from what we know. And I'm wondering, what kind of healing have you been able to, from what other people within that may be reflective in this book, are just from people from reading this book. I know that there's been lots of different bookstores, not just here in Calgary, but nationally, who've, I'm sure, read this. And I mean, and I can only, as someone who understands the settler experience and who does not identify as Filipinx, and curious about where other folks have been able to find healing, and maybe that's not the words that they would use, but because of this book, or because of like this idea of like, oh, I'm connected to something. Any thoughts about that?
The intent, I'll first speak about intention of what the book was about, then maybe I could find a way to get back to your question, because
Yeah.
I absolutely love that there are people outside of the Filipinx diaspora who enjoy the book and have the book, such as yourself and friends I have. And throughout the book, there are maps, like right from the very first inlay, the inside cover, from nativeland.ca, where we recognize territories, and the map doesn't have the borders of provinces or the colonized borders that separated people. And it might be a little zoomed out, so you might not be able to see, you won't be able to see Sutina, but Treaty 7 is there in the middle. And I think actually, and also even the bios where people say what languages their parents speak, what regions from the Philippines they say they're from, because that's something that I find that people ask whenever you meet somebody, like, oh, where are your parents from? And there's a duality in that, because some people think, oh, they're asking me because they want to judge me from, oh, I'm from the province, or I'm from the city. Like it's kind of like a social, some people see it that way. I see it as like, can I ask you if you know what that's all I want to know. I want to immediately ask people, but that's where my mom is from. And there's similarities in, of course, in regionality. My point is, coming back to intention, I think on the journey of anti-racism, of understanding positionality, we're learning how to see ourselves in the context of being on these lands in a different way from how we were programmed to see them through institutionalized education. And I think the connection that people see might be that there's a different way of looking at success, or what community looks like, because I think we're creating it, because Filipinx diaspora within Canada, we'll say, we're creating that Canadian Filipinx identity. And it takes time, it takes exploration, it takes self-reflection, it takes self-awareness, and also, building those conversations with other people who are on similar journeys, or maybe just beginning, or so. Yeah, I think I lost.
No, I mean, I think when you talk about intention, something that when I look at this book is, I mean, it is sort of framed as like a coffee table book, in terms of, you open it up and, you of course read all of it in one sitting, but it's that sense of like, like what's here? And one thing I really like about it is, in terms of how accessible is the glossary, actually, is that it has all of the different words that are used by folks who are, their stories are being told, but also what I think what it gives to me is like the sense of like, if you didn't know what what cisgender is, it's in there because it's talked about in the book, and you go, I wonder, are the various, or maybe you're someone who only speaks English, but then also can read and go, oh, what does that mean? And you have words like sex positivity, trans feminine, what's decolonization. Like there's a whole glossary here of really great words that I don't think necessarily in books like this have. And to my point about how valuable that is that I think it really helps to understand you could be someone who none of these things are in your vocabulary. And you're reading this book going, oh, this is, oh, wow, like a book about like, you know, and this is might be the language that one you might use, like the Filipino experience. And they open it up and they're like, oh, whoa, okay, interesting. Didn't know that was a part of it. And so you can come to this glossary and look at it and go, oh, it's like it's supposed to be accessible for even those folks who maybe haven't used and understood that language. And I'm curious about, I think what you were saying about that interconnectedness is wrapped up in the word, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but kapwa.
That's good.
Which is togetherness.
I can't correct you.
Is togetherness, interconnectedness, kindred, fellow being, equally shared identity, the core construct of Filipino psychology. So the sense of like interconnectedness is, I think, that you were even referring to earlier about like the intention of the book. That I think this like it's just like brings people, and you mentioned that in the introduction too, just brings people to some sort of like, oh, like I'm home, or what has maybe surprised you about creating this book during this time that maybe wouldn't have. The sense of community has really changed, and that's why we want to kind of hold space for people in these conversations. And I'm wondering if this book, in some ways, of completing the book during this pandemic time, has been different than maybe if we were in normal times. I'm curious if there's any connection there, or like anything that like resonates with you about that idea.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think many of the events that preceded or that happened with Bahagari while this book was completing also informed what we put in it as well, as far as terms, as far as even adding things that we found missing, like adding voices that were not submitted when we had a call for pieces. But the need to see ourselves reflected in groups is still needed, whether it's in person or whether it's online. And I found that though, queerness is often, spoken to through romantic relationships or just in that sense, it's right. It's also identity, community, politics. So identity encompasses all of those parts of one's identity, orientation, but we had, like, for example, you came to that event last year about speed meeting, like within the queer, like the QT BIPOC community, and I thought that was really telling that we just needed to have queer spaces. There aren't places here in Calgary like that I can walk to or like drive to be in a community of other queer folks, and especially my age. And I think it's just nice to be able to have spaces where you could just talk to people without that pressure of like, oh, I gotta like make them like me in that way. I just, we don't necessarily always, I find that friendship is such a deep, intimate relationship for myself with my friends. Sorry, I forgot your question. What did I learn? What was surprising?
Well, I guess, yeah, well, that was the kind of the initial question, but just about where, I mean, you're really just tapping on the sense of like community, and community can provide healing, especially the kinds of communities that are hard to access. It can be so refreshing, and the idea about an idea of just like, oh, like I can there's no perfect queer person, there's no perfect person about and how they can show up, but what it means to show up. But what I like is like, you don't necessarily have to have a glossary with you to be in community with people that are like you, because they speak your language, whatever that might mean. And I think that's so important. And also to say too, that as well, like the comfort to be able to ask questions, or to like get the vocabulary and the understanding can also be there, that's not there in maybe spaces that you've been traditionally excluded from. And so I guess to me, it's like, yeah, that like for people that maybe you've talked to about the book, or just the spaces that you're trying to hold for folks, especially during this time, has it been more important than ever because of sort of the disconnection? To your point, like, yeah, we were meeting in online spaces. We've been trying to like still like, it's almost like people need this even now more than ever to heal because of like the separation. And so yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like, was there something that, and you say you were adding things along the way, and I mean, we're definitely not out of any kind of like this pandemic, but what I'm curious is the question about what surprised you. I'm curious, was there anything that came out of this that surprised you, or the process, or how people are relating to the book as like that sense of healing for them?
Yes, actually, I was surprised at how many people would cry like reading it or like seeing it. And yeah, there's a lot of intention put into this book, and care. I think speaking to the need for community and healing, another discovery is that we're not very good at conflict resolution. And what's surprising is how easily I think people cancel each other in our culture today. Yeah, I think canceling is a very harmful way of protecting sometimes you need to protect yourself, but I mean, yeah, there aren't many people who can offer mediation. Another thing that surprised me is like learning about my own homophobia. Even though I made this book, put this anthology together, absolutely. It's hard to navigate that and to unlearn that. And you don't notice it until
you wrote a book about it.
No, you don't notice it until you meet other people who are able to, acknowledge that. And then, it's like, wow, I have that too.
I mean, you're talking about a couple of things though, about like how hard community is though, in terms of how one can show up, right? And what that means, but then also that conflict that's always possible in community. And like, how do we, but to your point, it's like that connection of people who like, will they get it, how I show up? Will they understand? Will they cancel me? Are we willing to hold each other accountable, but also hold each other with some grace about what it means to show up? Because I think like in spaces that are already so marginalized, or in communities that are already so marginalized, and when you find it, it's like, oh, like this is like, it's refreshing. It can be healing, but also can be really hard, because I think there's some things that I haven't been able to like to confront my homophobia, because I've never been connected with people who like I've been in cis straight spaces that you just sort of like, you don't even know it sometimes until you're like, oh, I've been acting and operating in a certain way. And yet, so I think it's sometimes that our connection to community is so fragile.
Absolutely.
And it's like, are we gonna because there's so many other layers to it. I mean, I think about people who maybe build community sometimes in like, well, one, the communities have always been there, and also are like, you just fit in. You can just go and find another one. It's like if it doesn't work or you burn a couple of bridges, like if you have like a sports team, maybe, it's like this is part of my identity. It's like you can probably go find another sports team. And it might be suck, it might hurt, but like it's there available versus it's like the marginalization of a certain community. It's like really hard. And and I'm curious about like where you feel like how do we, to your point, like how do we show up for people in those sort of maybe fragile spaces? What has it meant for you to show up for people in those spaces?
I'm not the best at that either, I think it's easy to go with what all your friends are saying or what everyone in community is saying, that person's harmful. But I'm all about relationship. If someone has challenges with other people, but they are still, accountable and honest and fair with me, then we speak through that. Then I can still be able to be there for them. People make choices to not want to be part of community after something happens. So, or not even want to talk to certain people. There's, again, I'm going to go back to the Blackfoot word, gimibibitsin, of empathy, the meaning of empathy, to have compassion for each other. Watch that film. Dr. Tailfeathers really explains it well. And empathy takes a lot of self-awareness, I think, to know where we're coming from so that we can show up for people, and take a breath, to take a moment before being reactive. But how do I show for people is listening.
Yeah.
And I've learned, like, I'm letting you know right now, I've been having some challenges with mental health and learning about my own healing as well. So, like I might not have capacity. I don't have capacity right now to hold space for many people.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is knowing how, like, people talk about self-care all the time, but like it is a continual renewal of awareness of where you're at, and learning what works for you. Not everything works for everybody, like the same thing.
And I think what you're speaking to is, and I appreciate what you're saying about that you're not at a space to right now show up in that way for others. And I'm really hoping that others can show up for you in what I think what you're speaking about is that community of care. It like what does that look like? Because of that, to my point about fragility being so, it can be really fragile, these spaces, and how important it is to kind of seek out that sense of really like having empathy being that foundation. Something that actually at CDLI, we were talking about just on Monday with our group, with our cohort that were going through the Success and Community Action Program. We were talking about empathy, actually, and what that looks like, and how not all the time, how it's very hard sometimes to actually be in the other person's shoes. Like we actually, like I can never be fully in your shoes. Or we sort of like empathy is being in someone else's shoes. And I think to some extent, there are folks that I can be more in, get it because I've been there, I've experienced it. And then there's some experiences that I've never had. But what does it mean to then build, and if you don't have those things, that discomfort can be really hard to be like, oh, I actually it's not that I don't want to be empathetic, is that I can't be empathetic. And that discomfort, we kind of talked about, like, what does that look like? What does that mean to hold that? Because and how do you get people to still, we talk a little about trust as a really important component to empathy, but also in this framing or a community of care, because there's so much struggle. And that might be a one way that we can kind of show up for folks.
Trust. Yeah, I think that's really a hard question. We're so new at depending on each other, I think, in community, maybe in this way, in understanding the value of shared lived experiences. It's not an old thing. I mean, it's not a new thing. It's just, I think, being intentional about building those spaces that for equity seeking groups is feels new, I guess. Well, maybe it isn't. Like, I'm just new to it.
No. I mean, can you talk a little bit about it's escaping at the moment, but that model that you have referred to, that you're going through with the cultural instigators, like that, I think is like, not only is that a new like way of like people are like, whoa, like that's great. It's a different way of doing things. I think it's because it's, to your point, like it's not something that is practiced. And so, yeah, would you mind just kind of maybe describing that a little bit? And then Absolutely. We can kind of see where we land with that.
Yeah. Janaya Future Khan on June 14th, 2020 did a Sunday sermon on their Instagram on how emperor penguins in the Arctic organize in their spiral. Like, to survive such harsh weather, they actually spiral so that the coldest ones are in the center, and then as they warm up, they move to the outside of the circle. So if we translate that to community organizing, then who are the coldest in today's society? Those impacted most by systemic barriers. Black people, Indigenous people, disabled people, people who aren't neurotypical, all the people who are outside of dominant culture, in quotations. So the Culture Instigators is a group of 10 activists and artists who are funded but not led by CADA, but supported by Cesar Cala and JD Derbyshire through the Citizen Artists YYC initiative that began last year during the pandemic to explore how artists are being impacted by COVID. And after the murder of George Floyd, the focus shifted from the focus on pandemic impact to racial injustice, because this pandemic has been very difficult for racialized people, for Black people, for Indigenous people, for Filipino people, everybody. But I think, after George Floyd's murder, the protests for Black Lives Matter raised a point of awareness where systemic racism could not be ignored by City Council in Calgary, at least. It was now acknowledged. So when it comes to organizing with the Cultural Instigators, originally it was a penguin spiral, but to translate it so that it was more contextual to Treaty 7, Kelly Morningbill brought it to my attention that it looked like, so you have Indigenous people in the center, next circle is Black people, and then racialized people, and then you have everyone else like allies and institutions on the outside. But it looked like white people were like circling around the people in the center. So Rial Many Wounds suggested that we translate that to look like a hearth circle, where you have elders and the children in the center, and then you have the warriors on the outside protecting, those with the knowledge and the wisdom to guide what is to happen with the group. So asking people we're learning how to ask, and learning how to how to offer to people when, when there's a challenge or there's a struggle. It's not just like, well, anything you need, just let me know. Like that open invitation sometimes is as a burden to people who are survivors, who are, and if you can offer a solid, concrete, practical offer, then that makes it easier so that they have choices, solid choices. And if they ask for something, if you say, is there anything I can do for you? And that the person you're asking says something specific, you have to be able to deliver it or find a way to deliver.
Mm-hmm. That's such an interesting point about community of care that I think is lost on folks, where it's like, to your point, it's like, yeah, I'll help you with this, or if you need anything, or can you ask me if favor or however. And I think being honest with also what we can provide and what it means to provide, because that's different for everybody. And because ultimately, if I'm in trouble and or if I need help, if people go, like, let me help you out, or even my experience within during the initial protests for Black Lives Matter, it was, people were like, oh, hey, like, coming out of the woodworks, of like, hey, I know you haven't talked in a while, if there's anything you can do. It's like, well, I'd have no idea what that means, but also, like, what does it mean for you to actually show up for me? And if I were to be honest, that question would have been, well, you've already kind of screwed up because it seems really inauthentic. but there were a couple of folks I was like, oh yeah, like it might mean like this, or it might look like this. And the accountability, I mean, I'm not going to check in with you if I asked you to say, hey, you should read this particular thing. Or my response is, actually, I'm curious why you're reaching out, like answer that in a way that's accountable. Some folks did, some folks didn't. And I think in some ways I was like, well, that's what I was asking for me to show up. Like when you ask me about what do I need to do, it's like, this is what I need right now. Versus I think maybe, it's like, hey, I have a discount to your favorite place. Do you want it? Yeah, I'll take it. And I'll go grab some chicken or something. You know what I mean? Like that is like, that can be so much more meaningful, but it's also with an understanding of how you can show up, because it's like positioning yourself. We talked a little bit about what it looks like to show up, and or how hard it can be also. Where have you, like, and I know this is because I know you, and that as much as you're saying it doesn't showing up has been difficult for you, I feel like you do show up and you're very aware of what that means. And because you said, like, they're now not the best. But my question is how do people kind of take stock though of how they can show up? Because just back to the penguin idea, I know that has shifted a little bit, as you said. I think the realization that those penguins have and how they go to warm people up and or warm other penguins, and then it's like this continual cycle of, because eventually the people on the outside will get cold, and what that means. But like, what I think about that is the weather doesn't change. It's still going to be cold. And it's understanding that that we are aware that this is the conditions that we're in. And to your point, like maybe right now you're needing warming up, or you're like, I'm curious, like how can people take stock of that? Because at the end of the day, even with like racism, it is for me, as I tell people, it is about being able to respond better to it, because it's the conditions that we're in. And so I'm curious, just to my question, what does it mean to kind of have, if people are listening, or when they listen, what does it mean to kind of take stock of how you can show up?
Yeah, I that's a really good question, because I think I've gone through this where I made some friends uncomfortable about how I show up um, in apologizing for my existence, even as a racialized person, colonized. I'm still a settler. Yeah. And I think to show up, you have to be able to love yourself, because you have to first be able to take care of like your needs. If you're giving
Mm.
away everything that you have and you have nothing, then you can't be an outside penguin. You should just fall into the ocean. Jump off that, that iceberg. No.
Or I mean, as a framing, I think it is like asking for I need to be warmed up.
Yeah.
Like get me in that circle, because I'm not doing very well. But to your point, I think it is that understanding and realization of like I need to be full or whole in order to then give. And when I do give, this is what I've got at the current moment. And I think our communities, or that sense of community, has been really interesting to look at this past year, around how people can give. And I mean, and we can talk about like from, I think rules have been broken. And I mean by that, I mean like from like the government or the rules, like the ways in which we sort of think about how to take care of each other have changed. And then also what it means to take care of each other. And some have done it well, some have done it not so well, but it is something that I think the conditions a little bit have kind of changed a little bit, like what that means.
Well, I think that also relates to even personal relationships. Like if you were just talking about just you and a friend, or even like romantic relationships, like people are always like, oh, I'm looking for my other half. No, you got to show up like as a full being. Like a lot of people say, you got to love yourself before you can love other people. And there's also, we're all healing. I think that's where, again, we return to empathy, as
Right.
is recognizing that you can't create healing spaces if you haven't done your own healing. Then you just bring your own trauma into spaces, and then build community on that, and then like ready to cancel people, ready to hurt people. It Yeah, we have to, like, healing is not just looking out, it's looking in. It's a like, even with the penguin spiral, you have your own penguin spiral within you. You need to know what your needs are. What are you protecting? What is your what's your cold spot? What do you need to address? What do you need to warm up? What do you need to love within you and what do you need to accept about yourself? What do you need to acknowledge? There's so many parts about um, about that penguin spiral that can be adapted to so many parts of your life. uh yeah, hurt people, and we're seeing that. And I think capitalism also shapes how we see abundance and how we see scarcity.
Curious to know. I feel like I say curious a lot, but it's what was made possible for you this year as it relates to community?
Can you just give me an example of something?
Well, I guess I'm curious about a year ago, or maybe even two, and thinking about, oh, like the struggle is real, the transitions are hard, community is hard, but what has been sort of unearthed because of where we've been at? What was made possible?
To be able to talk about racism openly and not feel afraid to speak to it and ask people, what do you mean by that? If there are any microaggressions committed in front of you, to me, or, just being clear of being able to say what I'm thinking, as opposed to having to center white comfort. Um, I think what's possible is we can only be angry for so long, and it has to transform into something where it is empathy. Even Resmaa Menakem says that white people need to also heal from their own colonization, and those are things that I'm learning about. I'm learning through being able to talk about anti-racism, racism, social justice, racial justice with more people than just our small group back in the day in Iraq, where only a few of us could speak to it. But even more so now, something that Bella C. Letner, our equity coordinator from Iraq, said that anti-racism work doesn't really, you don't see the progress right away. You don't see change right away. It might be like an incremental change, and that should be celebrated. But it is like, it's not like you're running a race. This is something that she says. It's like an interpretive dance where you're pushing and pulling against invisible forces. And I've been doing a lot of more interpretive dance in my own apartment by myself, of course. That's not a community. I don't know. I feel really isolated. Let's put it that way, Tyson.
Well, I mean, I think what you're saying though is it's hard. Interpretive dance is hard to like assess. It's hard to figure it out. But like that slow burn or that race meant, you know, the jog has, and I do feel that has lurched a little bit more forward in terms of what we do and how we can talk about it. Like back to that glossary, like I feel like more people are like reading up on it, and at least like it's not so shocking to be able to look at that for folks. Not everybody, but for some, I think that it's been really important.
I think one thing that I've also learned is that all of the pillars of white supremacist culture, racism, patriarchy, colonialism, there's one more, sexism, all those pillars, they all branch out in every field of advocacy. Like if you're, advocating for environmental issues, it automatically leads right back to Canada Incorporated as an extractive company, from the beginning. That gaffe that Trudeau just said at a conference about like, what's Canada's energy transition plan? Canada is a great, natural resource company, and it speaks volumes to, there will be, definitive choices made that prioritize capital gain over Indigenous lives. That's just how this country rolls, and it's been doing it and continues to do it even today. And Gidminton at the Wet'suwet'en front, the Tiny House Warriors are pushing back, but I mean the RCMP are armed. So while people are in peril, this is the time they decide to hit. The RCMP are going in to remove the final camp. So
does it feel comfortable, or not more comfortable, but to be able to say what you just said in a little public way and feel like that that's not going to rattle as many people?
I don't know about that. I think I think part of the the anti-racism work of racial justice work is that it gives us the space to learn about these terms, to be able to articulate what we're experiencing, to be able to identify microaggressions, to be able to identify systemic oppression, be able to say it and call it out. And but I don't have much of a filter anymore. I also feel like I feel like I have nothing to lose by saying these things. Like, the truth is good for everybody, but not everybody wants to hear the truth. Not everybody is ready to address it head on and say, we can do something about this. That's the way that's how the system works. That's how Kyle Rittenhouse, is that his name? Kyle, whatever his name is. gets completely, gets off scot-free, no charges. I think white privilege is becoming very clear to many people in in the past year, 2 years. I think more people are more emboldened to be able to say these things. So yes, to answer your question.
Healing is such a complex thing. And I'm really grateful to not only know you, but to know that there are folks like yourself who are looking at themselves in order to then still produce things like Home is in the Body, Two-Spirit, LGBTQIA plus FillipiniX Femme North of the 49th Peril, to find that, to hold space for healing. Because everything that you just said about the conditions that we're in and the intentional conditions, I think that people create, it's sometimes the only thing that we can do. And I really hope that my hope is our communities, and I mean this for anyone who's in relationship with each other and whatever that might look like, is despite all of it, can find and replicate healing for each other. And so I appreciate our conversation. I think providing the space to talk about these things in all the different ways, and the people who, and the surprise twists that these conversations can take, and allowing for people to peer into what we're talking about is so important. So thank you so much, Jaqs, for providing the space and conversation.